up in wonder. Nothing I can say and nothing I can do, but this one thing is needed, a broken spirit. Lord, break me and make me yours. Lord, break me and make me everything you want me to be. I yield myself to your will for me. Lord, break me and make me yours. Lord, break me and make me everything you want me to be. I yield myself to your will for me. Lord, break me and make me yours. Lord, break me and make me everything you want me to be. I yield myself to your will for me. This one thing is needed. This one thing is needed at the feet of Jesus, looking up in wonder. Nothing I can say and nothing I can do, but this one thing is needed, a broken spirit.
Hello, All People's Church family. Thanks so much for tuning in this week to our broadcast. Pastor Jeff here. I pray that all of you are well. So it appears that we finally have a solid date we can count on for in-person services back at church. I talked with Pastor Bill this past week, and the Bishop of Virginia for the Methodist Church has designated June 27th for a return to services. That's a Saturday, and so we're going to be having prayer meeting at 5 o'clock before service and service at 6 p.m. on the 27th. For the immediate future, we're not going to go back to having fellowship dinner or children's church or the nursery. It's going to be at least a month before we look to bring those programs back online. Now, your kids, of course, are welcome and free to sit in the services with the adults like many of us did back in the day. But we're going to resume our Wednesday night services as well. So Wednesday, July 1st, 7 p.m. will be our regular midweek service at Court Street. I'm looking forward to seeing all of you and getting back together with all of you, and I hope that you are looking forward to it as well. And next week, we'll have some more guidance about what you can expect as you return to services. Okay, so last week, we began what is going to be a biblical examination of race and ethnicity. Now, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this first and foremost so that as Christians, we can do a heart check of ourselves and see if there are any attitudes or perspectives in there that don't line up with God's word. That's the whole point of why we study his word, right? Is to allow for conviction. And the reason this is important is because the Church of Jesus Christ at large is a segregated society, and it does not reflect the heart or the kingdom of God that way. And I believe that in the midst of all this uproar about the George Floyd killing, hey, maybe for once we'll have the steam and the momentum to break the back of the spirit of racism in the church around the globe. Like, would not that be the ultimate glory for God? Like, I can see how the enemy thought he was going to use this tragedy to just rip our country apart and sow discord among people. And then wouldn't it just be like God to totally stand the situation on its head, and what the enemy meant for good, God totally redeems and transforms his church through it all. I mean, that's what I'm praying for, because this problem of racism is a God-sized problem. Now, at the same time, as I mentioned last week, this issue is profoundly complex. For the white people among us, who rarely have to deal with any form of racism, if at all, the issue is simple, and it has simple solutions. And part of the reason white people have been largely dismissive of the whole race conversation is because of that mindset. There's been a real lack of critical thinking about the issue of race and the issues that contribute to its complexity. We're going to talk about some of those tonight. For the people of color who have to deal with racism, the situation involves history and tradition and culture and religion and economics and politics, as well as a bunch of other factors. So where does the church come into this? Well, obviously there are other important complex issues of life that the church is involved in, and for which scholarly thinking and teaching and preaching and reflection and books exist in abundance. But when it comes to race, there's actually very little. Among white Christians, we've been virtually silent. There's not a lot of teaching on it. There's not a lot of interest from congregations in it. And those attitudes have carried over even into the biblical academic circles as well. But racism does infect the church the world over. And it's not just limited to black and white skin color issues. Maybe you didn't know this, but today, in 2020, there are racial tensions within the church between Eastern and Western Europeans. In Asian cultures, racism exists in the church between Japanese, Korean, and Chinese Christians. Many Christian populations in Africa are separated by tribe or ethnic groups. Some of these groups have animosity towards one another that goes back decades or hundreds of years. In some places around the world, Christians of different ethnicities even go to actual physical war with one another. So while here in America, we're most prone to think of this issue in the American context, primarily between black and white people, the reality is the Church of Jesus Christ around the globe is suffering and sick on a global scale with racial issues and drastically needs a touch from the Lord in this regard. If we can't eradicate racial issues from the church, what hope does the world have? We all know that the world is becoming smaller by the day, figuratively speaking. Look how fast coronavirus spread, which means that as the years progress, we're going to see hundreds of ethnicities come into the church. And that's a huge reason to celebrate. But if we don't have a solid biblical foundation for dealing with such a mixed company of people, then we're going to be held back by racism and prejudice and bias. We got to be prepared for those times. The times are changing, and it's time we changed with it. The second reason we're studying this is because of some of the just flat out biblical myths out there, some bad teaching that's out there, some ways that scripture has been used through history and maybe even still today in some circles to actually justify racial attitudes. And that's not good. In some cases, the teachings are not just that they're not good, they're heretical. And we can't have any heresy up in here. Lastly, I hope that you will just enjoy this teaching in general, that it gives you a richer, fuller understanding of the Bible and its context, the heart of God, and his plan for his people, and just how purposeful he is about making sure everyone is included in his kingdom purposes. So tonight, here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about history. And what we're really going to do is we're going to set the stage for the next few weeks of coming talks. If you know me well at all, you know that I like to talk about hermeneutics and biblical interpretation. Why? Well, mainly because Christians do such a horrible job at taking the Bible out of context. We use verses in ways that they absolutely were not meant to be used. We allow our perspective to form the meaning of the verses we read, versus allowing the meaning of the verses to form our perspectives. And it leads to just bad biblical interpretation, which leads to bad teaching and bad theology, like what I addressed 2 weeks ago on biblical authority. So it's a big pet peeve of mine. And one of the things that we constantly have to deal with as Bible readers is the interference of our own cultural pre-understanding. Cultural pre-understanding. Cultural pre-understanding is the tendency that we all have to read a portion of the Bible and then interpret it through the lenses of, or from the perspective of, our own personal cultural context. Now, we're not doing this purposely for the most part. This is a subliminal thing that just happens. When there are gaps or missing details to a story, we imagine in our minds and we fill in those gaps with what we know from our own culture. And we end up projecting our culture into the stories and our understanding of things onto the characters. Now, part of the reason that happens is that it just helps us naturally relate to the story better, and it helps us understand the text better, which is not a bad thing. But if our cultural pre-understanding is off, then it also skews the meaning of the text, and then our beliefs get skewed, and then we end up with a warped view of the Bible and what it was actually saying. What does that mean practically? Practically speaking, it means we're influenced to look at things a certain way. For instance, for hundreds of years in the world of art, individuals, characters from the Bible were portrayed in art as either Europeans or North Americans. When Michelangelo painted his painting of the Last Supper, he painted 12 European-looking white dudes seated at the table. It means that when some of us read Exodus, we see and hear Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner talking in our heads when we're reading the dialogue between Moses and Pharaoh. It means that when we read the Gospels, every time Jesus is speaking, we picture Jim Caviezel and hear his voice from the Passion of the Christ. So those images from our culture, they play a part in forming our perceptions. And because we've pictured Moses as Charlton Heston, this strong white guy leading the people of Israel out of bondage, then we naturally picture in our mind's eye a mass of white people wandering through the desert when we're reading Exodus. Subtly, what this does is it ends up having an impact on our theology, and that impact is not correct. What I'm going to show you through this survey, especially of the Old Testament, is just how large of a role people of color had in the Bible and with the nation of Israel, especially Black Africans. And you might be tempted to assume that there's a negative role to that because we tend to picture the children of Israel as all looking a certain way. But you're going to find out that that's not accurate. And in academic circles, scholars have had the chance to point out the significant contribution of people of color in the Bible, but it's been largely ignored. Very few scholars even comment on it, and this is probably attributed to their own cultural pre-understandings. Even though scholars are supposed to be completely objective, turns out they're not. And this stuff is easier to slip into than you might think. So that's another reason we're going to go through this study. Now, I want to give you an example from the biblical academic world. This will help you understand what I'm talking about. One of the people groups that we're going to be talking about is the kingdom of Cush, C-U-S-H. Cush was a black African kingdom that existed along the Nile River south of Egypt. Now listen to this. I'm going to lay out some frequency of terms and then the corresponding commentary related to the peoples that are mentioned. Okay, here's an example. The term Cush or Cushite appears 54 times in the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. The term Hittite or Hittites occurs about 61 times, with 10 of those times being directly related to when the Bible mentions Uriah the Hittite. We all know who that is. The Hittites were an Indo-European people group. The terms Arab, Arabs, or Arabia appear less than 20 times in the Old Testament. Neither the Sumerians nor the Hurrians are mentioned directly in undisputed biblical texts. So let's recap. Cush, 54 times. Hittite, 61 times, or 51 times if you omit Uriah. Arabs, less than 20. Sumerian and Hurrians almost never mentioned in the Hebrew biblical text. If you read a lot of scholarly articles about biblical people groups from the ancient Near East, you will almost without exception find that the majority of time is spent discussing the Hittites, the Hurrians, the Sumerians, and the Arabs. Cushites are rarely mentioned or discussed at all. There's a classical book called Peoples of Old Testament Times. It was written by D.J. Wiseman, and it came out in 1973. It has 13 chapters, each one dealing with the various people groups of the Old Testament. There is a pretty large chapter on the Hittites and the Hurrians, but nothing on the Cushites. There's also a chapter entitled The Arabs and the Ethiopians, but the discussion on Ethiopia is only one page at the end of the article, and there's only one sentence that mentions the biblical land of Cush. Now, a book called Peoples of the Old Testament World, very similar title, came out in 1994. It was supposed to be a revised work or a newer work that updated Wiseman's book. It also had 13 chapters. This second book completely removed the chapter on Arabs and Ethiopians and added one in on the Sumerians, who are one of the people groups that aren't even directly mentioned in Old Testament texts. In this book is also a map of the ancient Near East from that time that extends only down to Lower Egypt and doesn't even show the kingdom of Cush. Both of these books are supposed to address the people of the Old Testament world, but neither one addresses the black African Cushites, even though the Cushites play a significant role in the Old Testament and are mentioned more than all those other groups discussed. You also have the Anchor Bible Dictionary, a very popular Bible dictionary, which many people hold in very high regard from an academic standpoint. But it follows exactly the same path. If you read about these Old Testament people groups in it, 2.5 pages are devoted to Cush, and 14 pages are devoted to the Hittites. The Hurrians, who aren't even mentioned in the Hebrew Old Testament text, get 3 pages in the dictionary, more than the Cushites, who are mentioned 54 times. What this does, this selective scholarship that you have these people doing, is it sends a message that there was little to no black African involvement in the biblical story, which is just absolutely not true. And that perspective persists in today's church. Because it's not presented in scholarly materials, pastors and Bible teachers never read about African influence, and thus they never comment on it when they're teaching. And it's not that we're trying to emphasize blacks over whites or any of that kind of stuff, but it would be important to mention these people and who they are, so that when we as American people, when we're Bible readers, the people of God understand that the people of God are a diverse company of people going right back to the beginning. And we're going to talk about all of that stuff extensively as we go through this survey. So as best we can, the first thing we're going to discuss is the ethnicities of the world at that time. As I mentioned earlier, tonight is going to be a history lesson. Who were the peoples of the ancient Near East composed of? Tonight, I'm going to talk about the Cushites, the Egyptians, and the Indo-Europeans. Now, ethnicity is very difficult to pin down. It's not as neat and clean as many people think. Traditionally, ethnicity has been looked at from a physical appearance or from language or from a religious basis. But oftentimes, ethnic identity is more of a socially constructed thing. You have geography in there, ancestry, dress, diet, other factors that come into play when we talk about ethnic identity. So we have to look at the evidence that we have to make the conclusions that we can to the best ability that we can. One of the few places with some of the clearest records of ethnicity is ancient Egyptian literature and art. Egyptian art portrays up to 5 people groups, and it portrays them with a remarkable consistency over a great period of time. On the tomb of Seti I, there is a scene that's been painted of humanity, and it depicts Egyptians, Cushites to the south, Libyans to the west, and Asiatics to the northeast. In the palace of Ramses III, you see the same groups of people represented, but also added into that portrait are the Hittites. The appearance of their languages in ancient writings is also very consistent. So we get a pretty clear picture of the people from the ancient Near East from this type of material. Now that material too is stereotypical, but because it's so consistent, it paints a pretty good picture for us of at least how the Egyptians perceived the people groups that lived all around them. Now, let's talk briefly about these 4 main people groups before I discuss the Cushites and the Egyptians and the Indo-Europeans in a bit more depth. The first people group is the Asiatics, which would be Israel and all of her cousins. We perceive that this people group is fairly easy to understand, right? If I ask most Christians, they'd say, well, Abraham's called, his offspring's become the Israelites. What more is there? What's the big deal? There it is, nice and clean and clear cut, right? Wrong. You have to remember that back in the ancient Near East, back in the Bible days, the people did not use terms to define people like nation, race, ethnicity, group, or country, okay? We can't just take our modern understanding of Israel and superimpose it on the people from the Bible. For instance, can any of you tell me what culturally distinguishes a Canaanite from an Amorite, or from the Israelites for that matter? Let's take Abraham's descendants, for example. If one of the great-grandchildren of Jacob, an Israelite, is living in Canaan, okay? Let's say he starts speaking the Canaanite dialect because that's where he lives. He marries a Canaanite woman. He starts worshiping Baal because that's who the Canaanites worship. Did he continue to be an Israelite, or was he a Canaanite? What about his kids or his grandkids? How were they raised? We know from the scriptures that the Israelites were always intermarrying with other people groups around them. So what did that do to their ethnicity over hundreds of years? So the ethnicity of these peoples are anything but clear cut. Another thing that we use to try and pin down when we're talking about ethnic groups, when we're trying to pin down ethnicity, is language. Hebrew is a Semitic language, and the Semitic language is broken down into 2 main groups. You have East Semitic, which is Akkadian, which is the language of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Then you have West Semitic, which includes Arabic, Hebrew, Canaanite, Moabite, Edomite, Ammonite, Ugaritic, Phoenician, Aramaic, and Amorites. So that's 10 people groups that I just mentioned of the West Semitic language group. Their languages would have been very closely related, linguistically speaking. And you can make a very strong case that Hebrew, Moabite, Edomite, Phoenician, and Ammonite all came from Canaanite language. That's how close their linguistics are. Now, these language similarities, they help us analyze the people groups of the Bible. But when we get into surveying the Old Testament, for example, we're going to see that we cannot call Adam or Eve or Noah or even Abraham Israelites, nor can we assert with any kind of certainty that their language was Hebrew. The Bible tells us, for example, that Abram was a resident of Mesopotamia initially, a place called Ur of the Chaldees. That location at that time has been largely proved to be Amorite, but the Bible, talking about Abraham, associates it with the Aramaeans. We see that from Genesis 24 when Abraham has his servant go find a wife for Isaac, and from Genesis 28 when Isaac sends Jacob away to his uncle Laban's house. Now we know the story that is God telling Abraham to move his family to Canaan. That's where he ends up living out the rest of his life once he arrives, and so do the next two generations. But both Isaac and Jacob returned to Mesopotamia to marry Aramean women. Jacob's sons do not. Judah ends up marrying a Canaanite woman. He fathers the twins Perez and Zerah by Tamar, who is also most likely a Canaanite woman. Simeon had a Canaanite wife. Joseph, he marries an Egyptian and has two sons. So even from the very beginning of Israel's history as a nation, they were a completely mixed company of people. You had Western Mesopotamians, the Arameans or the Amorites. You had Canaanite in there, and you had Egyptian. In fact, it wasn't until after the exile from Babylon that the Jews really emerged as a distinct people group. The Jews at the time of the return from the exile, they became very purposeful about defining their ethnic boundaries, and their Judaism became quite distinct from everything around them. Now, as far as appearance, the Israelites would have looked like all their neighbors. And they would have looked like the modern day Israelites and Palestinians. Now, of course, that's a broad overgeneralization, but the point is, okay, for Americans reading the Bible, these were not blonde-haired, blue-eyed white people that we're reading about in the Old Testament. They were very much dark-skinned looking people, probably more resembling modern-day Arabs than anything else. Now, let's talk about our first people group. We're going to talk about the Cushites. I realize I'm squinting. My kids tell me I look all mean when I'm squinting, but it's because of the light. So, one of the more confusing things about studying the Cushites is that they have not been consistently referred to by the same terms in biblical scholarship, okay? The people and the land has been referred to Nubia, Wawat, Cush, Meroe, and Ethiopia. 5 different things. Now, based on some of the time frames in history, a lot of these terms would have been appropriate to use, even though they can be misleading to those of us reading it. But the area of ground we're talking about belonged to a continuous stretch of land that was along the banks of the Nile River, south of Egypt. We're basically talking about modern-day Sudan. When we look at the map, this is what we're talking about. The Egyptians referred to this area as Teseti, the land of the bow. The Cushites were world famous for their use of the bow and arrow, and we're going to talk about that probably next week, maybe the week after. Within this land known as Cush, there was basically 2 halves, probably divided by 2 main tribes. You had the northern part called Wawat, and the southern part that was called Cush. In the time of the 18th dynasty of Egypt, which would have been around 1570 BC to 1305 BC, these 2 provinces of Cush were very distinct. But soon afterwards, the terms used to refer to them started to be used interchangeably. What you had happen is the southern area of Cush became more powerful and soon dominated that whole region. And so the term Cush became the predominant word used by the Egyptians to describe that whole area and the people from that area. Part of the reason that there is confusion over what term is used to describe this area is because of the Greeks. When the Greeks started coming south, right, they called all black people south of Egypt Ethiopian. The word Ethiopian means the burnt faces. Since most of Greeks' encounters with black people were with the Cushites, because the Cushites were heavily involved in Egypt, almost all Greek literature, when it mentions Ethiopians, they're actually talking about Cushites. What we know as Ethiopia today is south and east of the land we're talking about and would not have been the same people or the same region as Cush or the Cushites. Akkadian literature uses the term Kus. The Hebrew Bible uses the term Cush, following the Egyptian and the Akkadian terminology. Then you have the Septuagint. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that predominantly uses the term Ethiopia, in keeping with the Greek geographical understanding of that region in that day. Even today, you still have biblical scholars that are using differing terms. It makes sense to some degree if their background is in Greek, or if they are New Testament scholars, they use the term Ethiopia. If they're Egyptologists or Roman era historians, then they use the term Nubia. So the confusion in regards to this people group continues to this day, which doesn't help the rest of us who are trying to figure things out. The Hebrew Bible, as I mentioned, consistently uses the term Cush for both the region of land and the people. But here's where we mess it all up. The English translations of the Bible are all over the map. Pardon the pun. The King James Version translates the Hebrew word as Cush about 1/3 of the time. The other 2/3, the King James Version is translated, the word Cush in there is translated as Ethiopia. The New Revised Standard Version, the New American Standard, the New Living Bible, the New English Bible, they all do the same thing. Sometimes they use the word Cush, sometimes they use the word Ethiopia. The frustrating thing is that there doesn't seem to be any reason why they choose one word in one instance and another in another instance. The NIV is the translation that typically gets it right the most. They translate the Hebrew word as Cush in English. In only 2 places do they vary. For some reason in Jeremiah 13:23, the NIV uses Ethiopia, and in Daniel 11:43, chapter 11, verse 43, they use the word Nubia. Like I said, it doesn't appear to be any rhyme or reason for this, and it's just misleading. If you're anything like me, before you know any of this stuff, you read the word Ethiopia. I've always assumed that it meant Ethiopia, but it doesn't. It means Cush. Now, the terminology isn't a huge deal, but it is important to realize who we're talking about when all of these different terms are thrown around. The group of people, the Cushites, they were a major world power for almost 2,000 years, and they repeatedly pop up throughout the biblical text. So that's why it's important that we know who we're talking about. They are important to this study of the biblical theology of race, because it's also clear that the Cushites were black African people with what is termed as classical Negroid features. The Cushites are portrayed the same way in Egyptian, Greek, and Roman art and literature. They are portrayed as people with black skin color, distinct facial features. There are literally hundreds of ancient portraits and art of various forms that represent the Cushites as clearly black, and black as in distinct from brown. Ancient literature does the same thing. For instance, in one piece of ancient Greek literature, the people of India are described as people that have dark skin. But then that same piece of literature goes on to say, they're dark, but not as dark as the Cushites. So there was a distinction. Now, the Egyptians, they portray the Cushites in great detail in their art, but they really don't talk about their features in their literature as much like the Greeks do. The scholars believe that this is because the Cushites were a common fixture in ancient Egypt. And because the Cushites were so intermingled with the Egyptian people for so long, the Egyptians didn't have any reason to discuss them or their physical characteristics, because to them it was nothing out of the ordinary. They were very used to their appearance. But it wasn't the case for the Greeks. When the Greeks start coming across the Cushites because they come south, they're totally startled. They're not used to seeing people of black skin. I mean, it was significant. Even Jeremiah the prophet wrote in Jeremiah chapter 13, verse 23, "Can the Cushite change his skin, or the leopard his spots?" So these were a very distinct people. They were different than the Egyptians that were to their north. They were much darker than Egyptians, and they had facial and hair features that differed from the Egyptians of their day. Even today, I mentioned earlier, we're talking about modern day Sudan. That's modern day Kush, okay, Sudan. But if you look at the Sudanese people, they're considered to have some of the darkest skin in the continent of Africa. All right, let's talk about the Egyptians. The ethnicity of Egyptians is apparently a very hotly debated topic in academics. Who knew? It shouldn't surprise us that early European archaeologists, they tried to connect Egypt and all of its successes as a society to Western ancestry, right? They were deniers that Black Africa could have possibly had any positive influence on Egyptian society. And they attributed most of the successes anywhere in Africa as coming from the West being Europe. It's a pretty racist perspective to have. Likewise, you've also had some African scholars that have tried to argue that all of the Egyptian advances were the product of African input and culture. These two views, they basically represent two extreme positions, but they were the dominant positions for probably 150 years or more, as these groups tried to portray either Egypt as blatantly white ancestry or blatantly black ancestry. Modern scholarship, thankfully, has progressed. The current view is that Egypt was a blend of both Black African culture and Asiatic cultures. The more our archaeology uncovers secrets, the more it appears that Egypt, before it ever became a world power, we're talking 3100 BC, the ancient inhabitants of the Nile River Valley were an indigenous people made up of tribes from the east and the west and the south. What is strategic about Egypt is this Nile River Valley region, okay? It was an area that is rich in resources. So no one really knows how Egypt developed. But we do know that Egypt was significantly ethnically diverse. From about 2000 BC on forward, Egypt was involved in foreign conquests. These conquests brought them slaves from many foreign lands. In addition, large portions of Egypt's military were foreign conscripts. A predominant figure in the Egyptian army were Cushites, but they also had Libyans, they also had Asiatics, and even later down the line, they had Jews and Greeks in their military. A lot of these people groups, upon completion of military service, they would marry an Egyptian woman, settle down in Egypt, thus becoming part of the Egyptian society. History actually reveals to us that Egypt was not a prejudiced society. Here's one of the things Egypt did that I found super interesting. When they would conquer a foreign territory, they would bring back the children of the foreign royal families that they had just conquered. And they would educate those kids in schools right alongside Egyptian children. Now, these Egyptian children weren't just any Egyptian children. They were the Egyptian children of Egyptian noble families. And the school was called the KAP, K-A-P. Once children graduated from this school, whether they were Egyptian or foreigners, they actually carried the name of the school as part of their name because it was so prestigious. We're talking like a private school academy kind of thing. And then the foreign kids that went to the school, when they completed it, they were usually put to work in civil service in the palace or in the administration of the Egyptian empire, right? Think Joseph, okay? Or the Egyptian army. So as a national policy, if you will, the Egyptians assimilated into their own culture people groups from all over the world. Many Cushites, in fact, are documented as being part of the school and then serving the Egyptian governing administrations. So Egypt has a varied history of leaders, okay? At various points in her history, Egypt had pharaohs who were not only Egyptian, but they also had Semites, they also had Libyans, and they also had Cushites as pharaohs. There's also a lot of evidence of interracial marriage in Egyptian culture. So it's very difficult to narrow down Egyptian ethnicity as strictly being of this ancestry or that ancestry. About the only thing we can say for sure is that Egyptians were not white people. On to our last people group, the Indo-Europeans. These would have been predominantly at that time, you'd have had the Philistines and the Hittites. These were the two major non-Semitic speaking peoples of the Old Testament. Israel would have been close cousins with the Canaanites and other Semitic groups of the region, but Israel would have been very distinct in culture from the Philistines and the Hittites. Like the Israelites, the Philistines migrated down to the area of Palestine. The English name Palestine actually comes from the term Philistine because of Greek transliteration and also because the Latin used by Romans. The origin of Philistines is largely unknown. A lot of scholars believe that they came from the Aegean Sea region, the coastal areas of eastern Greece and western Turkey up in the Mediterranean. At the end of the 13th century, this is what happens. You have this area up there that goes through a time of significant upheaval, and many people fled the area, okay? And they pushed down the coast of the Mediterranean Sea on the east side and down into Palestine, even as far south as Egypt in some cases. Ramses III, he ruled Egypt from 1184 to 1153 BC. He documented well defeating these people in both land and sea battles on many different occasions. The Egyptians actually referred to them as the sea peoples. The Bible, in Deuteronomy, in Amos, and in Jeremiah, they associate these people with the island of Crete. Whether they originate from Crete or whether Crete was just a stepping stone as part of their migration, we don't really know. But the Philistines were a very powerful people who settled along the coastal plain of Israel, and they wrangled with Israel for a long time for domination of Palestine. It was finally the conquest of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Those invasions, that's what eventually wiped out the Philistines altogether. Either through war or assimilation into other cultures or deportation or incursion of foreign settlers, the Philistines pretty much faded from history with those two foreign powers invading. One of the biggest distinctions of the Philistines that the Bible repeatedly mentions is that the Philistines did not practice circumcision, whereas a lot of the people groups down there did. The other major group that appears in the Old Testament is the Hittites. Their origin is also unknown. They apparently migrated into modern Turkey around 2000 BC. Within about 300 years, they had become very powerful, and they were also a big influence on the geopolitics of the ancient Near East for about 510 years. By 1190 BC, they had completely collapsed as an empire. In the 13th and the 12th centuries, they pushed south into Syria. They came as far down as Canaan. During their time in Syria, they had frequent run-ins with both Egypt and Israel. These two people groups, the Philistines and the Hittites, would have been, as far as the Old Testament goes, the whitest people of biblical literature, okay? If you could even say that, because they weren't exactly white people. They would have looked like modern-day Greeks or Turks, Okay? So those are the people groups of the Old Testament. And what we can see from all that I just discussed is that there was a wide range of ethnic diversity throughout most of them. Contrary to popular opinion or perception, none of them looked like modern Europeans. None of them looked like white Americans. Okay? And although ethnicity is not as clear cut as some would assume, we can still make some distinctions between the various people of the regions. The group that we'll see the most through this survey is obviously the Northwestern Semitic group, which was the Israelites, the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Ammonites, and the others. We'll see the Cushites, the black Africans playing significant roles. We'll, of course, see the Egyptians, a mixture of black Africans and Asiatic people. And then, of course, we'll see the Indo-Europeans in the Philistines and the Hittites. But that's a pretty multi-ethnic group of people that is setting our stage to talk about Old Testament history. Like I said at the beginning, we began this discussion to just frame out who the major players are that we're going to see throughout the Bible story so that we have a proper foundation upon which to build a proper and true biblical theology of race. All right, so I hope that you enjoyed that. Next week, we'll start at the beginning of the Bible in the book of Genesis, where we're going to combat and hopefully put to death some of the first myths and common things taught as biblical theology that are not true. I want to challenge you over the next week to refresh yourself on the first 12 chapters of Genesis before next week, because they're critical to understanding biblical theology in general, but they're also critical to understanding biblical theology of race. What we're going to be discussing next week is being created in the image of God and what that means. We're going to discuss the scattering and the description of the people of the earth into different families, languages, lands, and nations. We're going to talk about the promises that were made to Abraham, and we're going to talk about the curse on Canaan from Genesis chapter 9. Some interesting things to point out there. In the meantime, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.